The Cain and Abel archetype is one that's been around since the series' beginning and has become one of Fire Emblem's most iconic. I think this is owed partially to its persistence and partially to how visually distinct it is. It's hard not to notice that just about every game comes equipped with a red and green knight duo. But while they may come across as simple gameplay staples, I think they have the potential to be something much more nuanced. In this video, I want to explore how the Cain and Abel archetype has been applied across the series. I think there's a lot more to discuss about these characters than some people give them credit for, and I wanted to talk about them. Before we get into all that, my last video got a few more views than usual, and my subscriber count increased by a bit. Welcome, my plan for Fire Emblem fandom domination is well underway. Turns out those YouTubers weren't lying, asking people to like and subscribe really does help. I want to try uploading more frequently, but despite the fact that I make Fire Emblem guide and video essays for fun, I do indeed have a job, so I can't quite promise a consistent schedule yet. Regardless, please like, comment, and subscribe, I really appreciate it. Let's begin where this archetype was first codified in Fire Emblem, with the original Cain and Abel. These two aren't particularly deep characters. They don't embody the now familiar serious one and goofy one dynamic that we see in later entries. Their primary function is gameplay based. They're two mounted units who join early and help round out your party. What is interesting though is the choice of their names. They're named after the characters from a Bible story. The biblical Cain and Abel are defined by betrayal and fratricide, with Cain murdering Abel out of jealousy. But Fire Emblem's Cain never betrays you or is even remotely antagonistic. Sure, you can have him fight Abel in Book 2 if you really go out of your way, but the context doesn't line up with the biblical narrative at all. There seems to be zero connection whatsoever, so why use those names? This is a bit of a reach, but stay with me. In Mystery of the Emblems Chapter 17, Setting Sun of Gra, there's a small detail that caught my attention. When visiting a village, Marth remarks that Altea and Gra used to be like family. That familial relationship was severed when Gra betrayed Altea, leading to the death of Marth's father. Now, think about that in light of the names Cain and Abel. Maybe these characters' names are symbolic, not of their own narrative, but of the world around them. Perhaps their naming was meant to highlight the nature of Ra's betrayal and hint at their impending punishment. It's far from a perfect one-to-one, but shows that Fire Emblem may be comfortable using characters as thematic shorthand. This interpretation starts to feel a bit more plausible when we look at how later games use the archetype. A quick aside, the Arcanea Chronicles art book tries to say that Luke and Roderick are Mystery of the Emblems Cain and Abel, but I don't agree. If anything, Cecil and Roderick make more sense for that role, but I honestly don't think any of these characters really fit. Because this art book was made long after Kaga left, I'm choosing to write it off as hearsay. Feel free to comment that I'm wrong, but I'm gonna skip them. The real second iteration of this archetype comes in Genealogy of the Holy War, with Nisha and Alec. Not only do these two have defined personalities, Nisha being uptight and duty-driven while Alec is more casual and flirty, but they also serve a more important narrative function. They lull the player into a sense of familiarity. Generation 1 of Genealogy is filled with callbacks to FE1. A blue-haired lord, red and green cavaliers, a bumbling knight, a green-haired wind mage with a personal tome who is also a prince in hiding, a reluctant blonde enemy knight, a thief escaping enemy custody with a cleric, and enemy myrmidon who can join you. These echoes aren't accidental, they're deliberate breadcrumbs designed to make the player feel like they're on familiar ground, so that when Chapter 5 hits, it cuts deeper. In this way, Nisha and Alec aren't just characters, they're tools of misdirection. While I was definitely reaching to try and find deeper meaning with Arcanea's Christmas calves, I 100% believe this to be intentional. The takeaway here is that I don't need a carbon monoxide detector. Fire Emblem really does use characters to convey subtle messages like this. This brings us to Thracia 776 with Cain and Alba. These two Knights of Leoncer are among the least developed of the archetype. They don't even have unique names, just being corruptions of Cain and Abel. All you get out of them are their death quotes, escape quotes, and endings. However, I would argue that their purpose lies outside of that. Cain and Alba aren't meant to be developed characters in the traditional sense. They're symbolic, they represent the life that Leif never got to live. In a different timeline, one where Leoncer wasn't destroyed, where Quan and Ethlin weren't ambushed, where the Empire never rose up, Leif would have grown up surrounded by loyal knights like Cain and Alba, much like Marth and Sigurd had. Instead, Leif grows up in hiding. His allies are a ragtag band of villagers, mercenaries, and rebels. Granted, stat-wise, the knights are actually a pretty significant downgrade from your starting group. Maybe it's meant to show that knighthood isn't all it's cracked up to be? These characters who should have been around since the beginning instead don't join until about a third of the way through the game. I think they're meant to represent what Leif lost. Now, I do want to go to bat for their personalities a bit, particularly Cain. Cain's ending calls him the taciturn tactician. He doesn't talk much at all, and it doesn't seem to be out of shyness or dislike for his comrades, that's just who he is. I think I find that so endearing because it's a personality type that you don't see represented in modern games. Quiet, introverted characters struggle to exist in a game that necessitates they have a ton of support conversations. And it's not like this personality holds him back at all. He still goes on to be one of the most influential figures in Thracia. He still holds value and influence as a person despite his reserved nature. As for Alba, his dialogue paints him as the happy-go-lucky one between them. What I find more interesting is his ending, where it highlights the tension between northern and southern Thracians. I really wish this were something more heavily shown in-game, but I'll take it. To me, this kind of subtlety shown in Cain and Alba's characterization adds to the richness of Thracia's cast. Going forward though, I think it's fair to say the Cain and Abel archetype started to lose some of its narrative weight. After Yggdrasil, the red and green cavalier duo became more of a tradition rather than something that carries deeper meaning. It's not that the characters themselves are shallow or poorly written, but rather that the decision to make them fit this archetype feels less intentional. They're often included out of obligation rather than to make a statement or reflect something about the world or the themes of the game. At a certain point, I wonder that the archetypes become more of a box to check off rather than something with interesting narrative potential. That's not to say this is true across the board. There are definitely exceptions where the Cain and Abel dynamic is used to support the story in a meaningful way. For instance, I would argue that Sain and Kent from Blazing Blade help reinforce Lynn's legitimacy as a lord. Despite coming from a nomadic background and being thrust into the role of nobility, she's still flanked by two loyal knights in the traditional Fire Emblem mold. It signals to the player that, while Lynn's origins may be unconventional, she's still worthy of the same narrative stature and support as Martha Sigurd. In that sense, the presence of Sain and Kent validate her position. Another example would be Sylvain and Ingrid in Three Houses. While not a perfect match to the archetype given that Ingrid is a Pegasus Knight, they visually and thematically echo the red and green knight dynamic. More importantly, they help the Blue Lions route feel like a callback to classic Fire Emblem. The Blue Lion's narrative is more traditional. It's about a noble kingdom under siege with a somewhat naive yet just leader trying to hold everything together. The party consists of a young male thief, a holy woman healer, a young female mage, an antagonistic sword fighter, an armor knight, and a pair of knights where one takes himself more seriously than the other. The dynamic between Sylvain and Ingrid contributes to the sense of familiar FE structure, particularly when contrasting with the more radical and subversive tone of Crimson Flower. Their inclusion helps establish that the Blue Lions are the old world path, where honor, duty, and traditional roles still carry weight. But these are the exceptions, not the rule. In most modern entries, the Cain and Abel characters feel like vestigial traits, archetypes that persist because they're expected, not because they're needed. Their personalities may be fun or engaging, but their inclusion rarely serves a larger narrative purpose. They're just kind of there, offering early game utility and a splash of nostalgia for longtime fans. The archetype started with a name that hinted at betrayal and moral weight, found real symbolic purpose in Yggdrasil, and now serves more as a kind of self-referential Easter egg, still appreciated but rarely transformative. Something I've noticed is what I'll call the Cain and Abel Jr. archetype. This is less of an official trope and more of a personal observation, but it feels like a spiritual offshoot of the original red and green cavalier dynamic. Instead of two established knights who flank the protagonist from the start, these are younger, less experienced characters who wear their traditional red and green and echo the archetype's themes of camaraderie, but from a more innocent or aspirational place. There are only two real instances of this that I can point to, and even then I'm only confident that one of them was actually intentional. The first, and the one I'm more sure about, is Franz and Amelia in The Sacred Stones. Franz is your classic early game green knight, reliable, good-natured, loyal to a fault, and already somewhat seasoned despite his age. Amelia, on the other hand, joins later, wears red, and starts as a trainee unit, full of potential but still needing guidance. Their personalities complement each other well, and their support conversations reflect a dynamic that feels very much like a younger take on the Cain and Abel bond, even directly referencing Ford and Kyle. They're not just echoes of the archetype, they're the next generation, and it fits well with Sacred Stone's themes of growth and rebuilding after loss. I lied when I said that was the first instance. Like with all things, Kage did it first in Tearing Saga with San and Frau. Like Franz and Amelia, they're both young knights, and once again, they wear the telltale red and green. San is hot-headed and impulsive, while Frau is more grounded and collected, demonstrating the dynamic that we've come to expect from this archetype. The similarities to the traditional archetype are subtle, but they're there. However, I'm less sure this was meant as a deliberate twist on the Cain and Abel formula, and more of a coincidental overlap in visual design and personality tropes. Still, bizarre and nigh unnoticeable details like this aren't something I would put past Kage. What makes this junior variation interesting to me is that it moves the archetype down a level in terms of experience and significance. These characters aren't veteran knights standing by a lord's side from the start, they're figures in training, learning to navigate a world of war and duty. They represent potential, and their growth helps illustrate the next generation's hopes and struggles in the wake of conflict. It's a neat little evolution of the archetype, not quite as deep or symbolically rich as my Yggdrasil boys, but still meaningful in a way that tie together gameplay, character growth, and the legacy of Fire Emblem storytelling traditions. So, what do we take from all this? The Cain and Abel archetype in Fire Emblem can be more than just two knights in red and green. At its best, it's a storytelling device that serves to reflect the world around it. In the earliest games, it's symbolic. In Yggdrasil, it becomes thematic and emotional, reinforcing the weight of legacy, betrayal, and loss. In later entries, the archetype still lingers, but often more as a tradition than an interesting part of the narrative. But even as its significance has faded, it hasn't disappeared entirely. There are still examples of how this archetype can be used in interesting ways or how it can evolve past what it was initially used for. The framework still has value, it just needs purpose. Ultimately, the archetype's strength lies in its flexibility. When used deliberately, it can be an interesting way to explore a game's themes and characters. When used reflexively, just because every FE game needs Christmas calves, it risks becoming little more than a color-coded gimmick. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway here. Archetypes are only as strong as the stories they serve. If Fire Emblem wants to continue using them, I think it would do well to remember not just what they look like, but why they worked in the first place. Don't add these archetypes just because that's what you do. Do it because they have the potential to make for an engrossing story when used with intent.